So this lesson is dealing with the SOAP-based web services. We'll be looking at this from a perspective of being able to do full create, read, update and delete using this. And I'm going to try and do this mostly within the confines of our lesson here as a practical demonstration. But I'll start off by using the slides that for this presentation as a sort of an aid memoir, so we can get going and understand what are the resources that are available to us to learn this. And we are going to look at this API, how we configure the web services, how we go about creating a session and using the objects and functions. Now, so in this lesson, I want to introduce the idea of the SOAP-based web services API for this, and to set up and use web services. All you need is CRM installed with a standard license key, and for using and consuming SOAP-based web services, you just need to use a development environment that is capable of forming SOAP transactions, being able to pass create the structure of the XML used within the context of SOAP. And what is this? What are we doing? Well, here you can imagine an external application needing to make an inquiry into Sage CRM. And imagine that what we're doing is wanting to have a external system be able to retrieve the telephone number for a particular company. Now, in order to do that, it needs to make a request, and because Sage CRM is a web-based environment and you're coming in from a remote area, you have to use a web transaction. SOAP works on the basis of passing the message in the form of an XML document to an endpoint. So you pass this XML package, which contains the details of the request and any parameters that are needed in the form of XML, and that is sent to an endpoint within Sage CRM. Now, web endpoint has to receive the message in a structure that corresponds to its expected format, and that format for the message is described in terms of the web services description layer, sometimes known as the WSDL. Right, can I just ask for people to mute their lines, make sure that I'm hearing a little bit of keyboard click in the background, so could you please mute that? So we've got web services. The web service comes in. We receive that in the form of this package of XML that corresponds to the expected structure that we have, and the endpoint then has the job of turning that into a set of instructions that CRM can understand. Now, typically what will happen is that you see quite a lot of activity inside the Sage CRM logs as the message is received and is unbundled into a series of SQL requests. So you might actually find you sent a single package within the XML, but it's then turned into maybe 20, 40 different SQL requests, depending on the nature of the message that you sent, as the data for the response is brought from the database, is assembled and then returned again in structured XML format. And the structured XML is then passed back as the payload back to the requesting application. So everything, like it's a typical web application where you've got a web request and then there is a web response, and we have to think about how we form the request and then we handle the response as well. And that's the coding that you would be doing inside your development environment. Now, the thing about the web services API is that it is just providing us with a mechanism to make inquiries about the data. So there isn't really anything to do with the interface generation. So There's no screens, there's no lists, we're not doing any of that. There is a little bit about information about the what's called the database schema, so there is a discoverable schema, but in terms of handling the interface, you are entirely responsible for designing the interaction with the database. You're only looking at being able to do tasks of creating a data, updating data, deleting it, and fetching data back. You have to handle everything, including if there is an error or any question about a timeout or an ending of the session. Now, you are sending an XML message. We're going to be seeing in a moment about how we can see this information. It's a very verbose mechanism of passing data. So that means you both pass not so much the data that is passed inwards, but the information that is passed back out in the result set is quite verbose. So there's a lot of XML that has to be parsed. You have to do a lot of checking for that, or rather Sage CRM does, and that means that anything like that takes time to do. So it's going to be considerably slower than the equivalent COM-based interactions. When we're doing COM or .NET, you're essentially doing binary interactions, and so those where you're working on the same server, interacting very, very quickly, you're not having to rely on intermediation through the web service, and there isn't this unpacking of the human readable text, because essentially XML is human readable. And because you're passing data in XML form, one of the things that you need to make sure as soon as you're using this, you have to be using Sage CRM within a secure environment, HTTPS. I say here on the slide it's desirable. In fact, I'd actually say it's mandatable, in the sense that you need to think about the security that web services are vulnerable, any web services are vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. Okay. There are a lot of factors which could affect performance, but basically you're still going to be database bound. It's always the database that is the most tightly important aspect of controlling performance within a CRM installation. Okay. So how do we get going? How do we start the process of configuring our web services and preparing for you? So you can see I'm building up now. I'm going to start demoing in any minute. I've got a series of things that we need to know about. This is the idea of the WSDL and the form that it's in. Let's actually start to switch into CRM. For this is you can see I'm looking at a WSDL here. The WSDL endpoint, you can see is localhost CRM eware DLL web services WSDL, and it is by default within the later versions of Sage CRM enabled, so you can read the WSDL straight away. And if we look inside the product, I'm going to go into Sage CRM. Here my instance is called CRM, and I'm going to go into the administration screens. And within the administration screens, I'm going to come down into System, and we can see that there is a option here for Web Services. Now, within the Web Services, you can see that we can enable the WSDL, and also enable Web Services. You can see that these are two sort of fields, which, first of all, the WSDL is the way in which you would explain to a development environment what are your structures, what are the things that I can know about to help me design my application, which is going to interact with you, and enable web services is obviously the closing or opening of the front door, which allows this to be used. We'll also see that users, individual user accounts, because this is a session that is created, have to also be enabled as well to be able to use web services. Now, there are on this screen there are a set of other options to be able to control, and if I move through some of these things that we can see on the screen, we can think about how we force logons, what are the considerations that we need to make for the handling of dates, because the dates may be in different formats. We can think, do we want to restrict any requests to individual machines? You can actually, in a very secure environment, you might want to open your port and only accept requests coming in from certain machines, and you can also then control the request sizing, both for the number of records to be returned, but also the amount of data that you might have to consume in order to carry out batch tasks inside. So you've got the maximum size of the request is the kilobytes that we're going to be assuming, and then the number of records are the number of rows that are returned within the set. So what you can see that this slide is starting to explain this. This is all inside the documentation, and again I'd go to help.sagecrm.com to be able to access this information. You can look at that and understand all of these options. I have to, for time, just brush over that and say please refer to the information that is in the help file. Here I'm also going to come in and start thinking about where we can use CRM. We have to enable a particular user, and so let's assume that, as we've got in here, enable web services. I've got my WSDL turned on, and we can see that there are different options here for handling the way in which fields are described. Drop-down fields as strings in the WSDL file? No. We've got the option of either displaying drop-down fields, selection fields, as enumerators, or they would be strings. And this is really, you can see that there's different types of options that might well be available to you. The WSDL is describing all of these different object types that will exist inside the system. So back inside here, back inside CRM, I need to enable a user. So let's go to users. I'll look first of all at my user who is the system administrator. So let's go and find the system administrator. What we will see is right down here within the options that this user is allowed for web service access. If I look at another user, Susan May, we can see that she is not. Oh, she is. Allow web service access. She is also enabled for web services. That's very good. Now, I will be carrying out a little project in a moment to get going with showing you how to create a web service interaction, and I will be using a test harness application which will show all the different techniques within the code that I've written. I will have written that using C#, and I'll show you where you can get this, and you can use all of the information that you might need. Here we've got another thing to consider, which is if you've got the system set up to be able to use web services, and you've got an individual user who is able to make and create a session through web services, we also have to know that there is individual data tables that are exposed as well. And so here this is down at the level of customization for the individual entities. So if we look to a company, or let's actually look to opportunity, for example, we can see in the external access that we have this enabled for web service access. Now please note that we've got this at the level also for S data. This is something that that next week I'll be talking a little bit more about. When you think about a view, one of the differences is that if you look to an individual view and look at the creation of a new view, what you'll see is that individual views can also be exposed to S data as well for fetch purposes. Inside the SOAP environment, you're only exposing tables to the SOAP web services. You are not exposing individual views. There are some techniques that you can use, but basically what we're looking at is a table interaction rather than any other form of interaction. So let's go ahead and start to create a project, or rather, before I do that, let's actually show you the sort of thing that you can do. Now, I'm going to be using resources that are assuming that you're using the SDK. So if I switch back into a development environment and I need to come over here, you can see that I'm using Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio. This happens to be Visual Studio 2017. And if I start to create a new project, we can ask what sort of project that we're creating. This would just be a standard, let's have a Windows form application. You know, I'm creating a Windows application, very simple application, and I might call this WS test. Now this is a first project. I'm not using where you say Sage CRM basic template or entity template. Those happen to be associated with the .NET API, but it is indicating that those templates were available in my machine because because I've installed on my machine the SDK, so the Sage CRM SDK. Now here is my web service environment, but like the best types of children's program, if I switch over to this slide, if I switch over to another environment, here's one that I created earlier. So I've got a design of a forms application here, lots of fields and things on it, and this is something called the Web Service Training Test Harness. Now this was last updated for 2017, but it is still a very valid one. It's a good comprehensive little show of how to do things. And if we switch over into the Sage CRM community, you can come and see this within the partner area of the community within downloads, and you'll see that there is a general development resources, all versions, and look down here to where you can see you've got the SOAP Web Services Test Harness. Now, if you don't want to install the full SDK, if you're on a machine which doesn't have that, you can actually download and work with the snippets for this separately. So you can actually have access to all of the development resources outside of the SDK, but it's much easier to download the SDK and install that on your machine, and it will give you the stuff that you need. But this test harness, once you've downloaded it, will contain examples of how to do everything that you want to do. So after this training course, if you want to learn more about it, well, it's downloading and using it and seeing this. And the interesting thing is that once you've constructed everything, you'll be able to start this project. And in my case, you can see this popping up, this little program. You can see that it is running as a Windows program. If I just switch over to have the browser open and then switch over, you can see that it's here. You can control what's called the endpoint, the target system URL, so I can update the endpoint that I'm going to use, and then I can start to use the credential of any of the enabled users. So it might be that I end up with putting in admin, and logging on, and you can see that I have logged on. There's my install details coming back, even the session that I'm creating, and then I'm showing here the confirming the endpoint that I'm using, all within this. And if I'm used to the idea of looking for a particular company, so let's have a look at putting in, there's the search for 28. That's that will be Gatecom. If I go and find the company using this, you can see that I've got examples of how to find things, how to handle drop downs, how to handle and change data within the interface, and I can save the changes there, and you can see that the record has been updated. So all of this is being handled by this little test harness, showing you the type of work that you can do. So this exists because today I will not have time to show you everything about the Web Services API, so you need to know where can you go to see examples of code that do all these different types of task. And if I look up to where I've got my web services, if I look up into into the download, this is where you can download it and get a hold of that, and basically this is where you're going to start using and working with the examples. Now I'm just going to close this down. Actually, before I do that, let me show you something interesting. You know that we've got I've logged on in here. You can see that I've logged on as a system administrator through the interface, and I'm still logged on. That second log on through the web service interaction has not logged me off here. I can move around. I'm still valid. If I go up into typing in localhost eware.dll, and then as a path option put sysadmin, this is going to tell me the sessions that are currently created for my instance. Excuse me. So you can see that I've got 2 sessions created, one through the interface and the other through web services, and you can see that I'm using one through the web services, and that number, you can see it ends in 689. If I go over into here, you can see that that is in fact the session ID that I'm working with here, 689. Okay, so this is demonstrating what CRM knows about the open sessions, and that would show up, that web services session would show up if I go into users and look down into user activity within the system administration screens. You can see that there, in fact, I've got my web services interaction shown within inside the logs as well. So you can actually see this reflected within inside both the logs and also within inside the interface to know how people are accessing the particular CRM instance. What we're going to do is to move on into looking at how we start creating our first application, handling the very basic, the idea of logging on and logging off, and working with basically working with the code and seeing how we start a project within inside the system. So how do we handle log on, log off? How do we do this? So we are going to be handling and working with a session very similar to the main interface, user logons. It is creating a session, so we know in architectural terms, because it's a session, if you think back to the earlier lessons when we were looking at the architecture, then we know that this is going into the eWare DLL. The big difference between the RESTful API and the SOAP API is that the SOAP API is going into the eWare DLL as its endpoint. The SData API goes in to the Java Tomcat based endpoints for its starting point with inside CRM. So it's like you come into the application in different ways, but the session ultimately is the you're still working with this. Now, I've mentioned the sysadmin as a way of monitoring what's going on, but let's start to create this first application. So I need to come across into where I'm working with. My form, and I think what I'll do is I will have a look at viewing my toolbox. Let's go and have a look at the toolbox, and I think I need a button. There's my button. Let's add in just a log on button. That's very stupid of me. There we are, button. So let's bring a button on to the form, and I'll copy that. And so I've got basically a log on button and a log off button. Let's put in here, and toolbox. I'll have a label as well. I want a label, and the label will be useful because it'll allow me to echo out my session ID and be able to and actually show that I've got that. What we are going to do here is log on. So actually, do I want to? Yes, let's go. So this is going to be my log on. Now, if you're working with a project, you can see that double-clicking within here is opening up my environment to start working with the project. But I can't actually do anything with web services until I make a web reference that allows me access to the WSDL. Do you remember when I was looking back here and looking at the importance of this thing called the WSDL? This is the source of the description that defines all the objects that I might be able to use with any code that I'm starting to write. So I need within my project to add a reference. So I'm going to go into the add service reference, but actually it's not now. Well, you could start to do it with the web service reference, but actually you tend to do it through the .NET Framework 2.0 web services format. So it's add web reference, and then we need to provide in here the reference to this location. So what's the web reference name that we're going to use? Well, I'll call this CRM. Or actually my CRM to make it sort of very clear. So that's my web reference. I can add that reference in here. And once we've done that, we can start to indicate that we're using the new namespace. So in the namespace, the web reference becomes available to us. So using WS test, and then in here we've got my CRM as the option that we've got. So there's the WS test. Now, in terms of being able to start and use this, now my environment has got the SDK installed. So I installed the SDKs. So I've got snippets available to me. So I can start now to use a snippet. And I didn't mean to do that. Let's go into here, right mouse click, snippet, insert snippet, my code snippets. And you can see that I've got access to either the .NET, because I'm working with C#, or web service. So it's obviously web service that I want. And I've got different examples of what to do here. So I'm going to start off with the idea of the logon. And you can see that here we are starting with what our service is going to be called. We're accessing this class called web service, and we are and this is underneath. It knows that it's come from WS test my CRM web service. So this is what we're calling it, and this is why we needed to reference the namespace up here. You can see that there are some options that we can use, but basically here we are going to be now handling the idea of a logon. Once that web service is defined, we can then start to issue our logons. Now, all this is just handling our password that as you are entering it into the interface. If you want the passwords to be encrypted between the requesting application and this, you have to be using HTTPS. In my environment, my system administrator doesn't have a password. It's the default for our demo system, and so I'm just going to create a logon, and what we will see here is then going on into creating some information about a service. Now, please notice that I'm using a method here, logon, which is corresponding to a method that was defined in the WSDL. So everything that we are using here is corresponding to something exposed within the WSDL. So there's the logon request in terms of the idea of the package that is passed, and there is the operation name logon, and you'll see that it is defined as having a logon request object and then a logon response type as well. This is what you see back in the code here. This is what, by including the WSDL as a reference, we get. So logon is the operation, and we can see that we're passing in the parameters, which are forming the body of what's sent, and then we can see that we have got a logon result as well. Excuse me. Right. Our logon then once we've got the logon result, able to start handling the returned information. I'm going to turn on logging and make sure that we see what's going on as I issue this initial request. Okay, so I'm going to save this. Before I run this, I want to go back into CRM to show you about logging so we can see and understand what the web services are doing. So if we go into System and go into Logging, to see web services, here is that we need to make sure that the system logging is set to be maximum. Web services will eventually be created in the same folder, but they are not listed as one of the standard types of logs that you can upload here. So we'll see our log created. If I go into where I've got my install of CRM, my instance of CRM, it'll get created inside the standard log folder. So you can see that I've got web services logs for today already. So if I open up that in here, you can see that I've got lots of interaction taking place. Now I'm going to clear out my log. I'm just going to unload it as well, so I can then reload it in a moment. So that's proving to you I've got nothing in my web service log. So back inside my little environment here, I'm going to start this application. So it starts to run. And we now have our button 1. So if I click button 1, we are going to discover that there's been a log interaction, and we can see that in here now we have got our request being issued. So that you can see a request has gone in, and you can see the actual XML that is being passed. And you'll notice it's in the form of an envelope. So if I look at this and look at this in a different environment, let's look at it, change the font and go up to a larger font, we can start to see that it's all neatly structured. It's in the form of an envelope with headers. So first of all, let's have a look at, there's our envelope. All these structures of where we're going. So our envelope, that's the operation, and that's the body. Okay, so what we've got is within the envelope, surrounding everything, we have got our initial set of information. Where is this going and how are we talking? And basically the envelope is saying we're all going to talk SOAP, and this is the endpoint that I'm the standard that I'm adhering to. Then inside here within the body, and SOAP, by the way, used to stand for Simple Object Access Protocol, but it doesn't stand for that anymore. It just stands for SOAP. So here we have the body. You can see the opening and closing, and within the body you have then the information about what is happening. So we have the operation type shown here, and then the parameters being passed here as well. And if I switch back into CRM and go up to where we've got our system admin, we'll see the number change because by logging on again we'll have destroyed the previous session. So we've got the session is 690 here. So we know that we've logged on again and created a brand new session, and so that's showing up inside CRM as a valid session. Okay, so I've created there a log on, and there's been a result that's come back, and that's shown again inside the log, because for every HTTP request there has to be a response, and this is where we see the response HTML. And in here, if we just focus in on what is the result, you can see the result contains one tag which is going to be the session ID. That result has to be handled by the code that we've written, and there you can see when you issue an operation, which it corresponds to a method within the code, it's going to be passing back a result that has to be captured. So every operation has a corresponding which corresponds actually we've got an operation that's basically an HTTP request, and for every HTTP request of a particular type there has to be a corresponding result set so it knows how to map the result. It's a strongly typed environment. It's expecting results to come back in a particular structure. And there we see that we've got the logon result, and that will then give us access to the idea of what are the structures inside the logon result. So we're able to make sure that we're able to get our session ID, and here you can see we're adding another structure into our logon result called our CRM service, which monitors or is responsible for the overall sense of what we're doing with web services. We're creating the session header, because any subsequent request is not going to re-log on. What any subsequent request is going to pass the credentials, and that credentials, those authentication token, is going to be the session ID. So we have to have a way of getting the session ID into so this application now knows can make subsequent follow-on requests. Okay. So how do we go about destroying the session, and how do we go about then logging off? Well, I want to be able to click a button to log off and destroy that session, and we'll look at that now. But before, let me just end that little application so you can see I've just crashed out and it's ended that application. So we can now back into the code so we can start to edit this. One thing that I should do if I switch back into our little bit of code is compare it with the example that that is the test harness that you can download from the system. One of the things that you'll find is that within the outside of the individual buttons, but within the overall application, I have gone in here to do the definition of the web service so that it's not local to an individual button function. So it's available to all of them. So this is within the structure of the class. So that's what that's what I've done here. Anything that is global, I basically have to move out to the level of the form. So you can see that's what we've done here. So the form 1, and that's what we've done in here. So I will take this web service definition, move that now up to here, and what this allows any of the functions inside to be able to access it. I just need to be able to make sure that that's the case, and actually probably need to move that here as well. Now, notice as well, this is talking about where the endpoint is. This is the service URL. This is you might have the WSDL, but the web services are directed to a particular endpoint, which is structured like this. This is called the service URL. Right. Now, the next thing to do, if we've been thinking about log on and log off, is that we have to create for ourselves the method that will destroy the session, and there we obviously need to invoke that. And in my little program, I need to go back onto my form and invoke my code for the second button, which is going to be now the log off. And so in here I can use snippets again, because I never write any code myself nowadays. I always use my snippets. So in here I should see the option to be able to log off. So I've got the log off, and what we're doing is carrying out the log off interaction. And because I moved my web service to the parental class, these classes underneath, which are below it, can actually see it. So I know I can use that method log off, and it's then looking at whatever is the session value to be able to destroy it. Okay, right. And if I save this and I'm going to start my little program, I've got my little screen popping up with these two buttons, button 1 and button 2. And if I switch over into where I've got my log, I'm in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to empty out my log, and I'm going to unload it from the interface. So my button 1 is going to there create the session, and we can see that within the log. So we know that the session has been created. You can see that it forces out the previous session by default. So you can see that, and it's created this attempting to log in admin. So we know that that's done. Now let's actually unload this once more, because now I want to call the log off. Now this doesn't do anything in the interface in here because we haven't got anything echoed out at this point. But if I now go back into that log again, you can see that we've got the logging out of the session. So everything is being mapped in here, and we can start to see the way in which the session is being managed. So remember, every operation that we do inside our code is an HTTP request, and every operation will have a corresponding response object. So there's our request for the initial logon, there's the response, all inside this XML envelope with the result contained in here. There's a session. Notice in here, as we send this request again, we now have within the session header the session ID being included. So anything subsequent to the logon will have the session ID within it. We happen to be calling the log off, which is of course designed to destroy the session. So we can see there's the log off, and we're passing in the session ID that we're destroying, and we can then see the result, which is to see that we have successfully logged off. So it's true. Back inside our code, let's end this little program, and we return back into the code. We can see that the log off is needing to have the value passed into it of the session ID. So that's why we have that ID value to know which session we're destroying. So we know that we can see what goes on in terms of the sessions within the logs. We can see what goes on with the sessions inside the activity table, and we can see also within this flag sysadmin, we can see the sessions that we're creating. We can understand what's going on. So that means that we've got all of these interactions available to us, and we can understand that because we've got a session, things like locking would also apply. We just have to be aware of it, and we also have to understand that we're going in through the EWDLL, and so we would have interaction with table level scripts as well. Okay. We've seen the logs, and we understand how everything is coming through into the logs and seeing how that's structured. Now, in the remaining time, and we are running out of time, this is where I'm going to refer you to the training test harness, because we've got lots of different objects. There are objects that allow us to carry out data interaction, 3 different methods actually: query, query entity, query record. They work in different ways, they are responsible for different types of interactions, and they have correspondingly very different loads within the system. If we think first of all about the query object, this is a idea that we are going into a general query on any entity within the system. So it's not aimed at a particular table, which a record, query record would be, and it's not looking with the expectation of finding essentially a single entity. This is going in and where we might want to get information about persons or companies. But the dangerous thing about this, and here's a dangerous thing if we're not aware of it, is that query is going to be requesting, when we request a person, we will be requesting all of the address information, all of the phone number, all of the email information as well. And there will be a lot of SQL interaction with a query. And it is a very verbose way of fetching information. Now, all of the examples of this, and there is discussion of the way in which we work with the query objects and things like that on the community. So we can come into the community, and if I do web services roundup, and you can see that there's an article, a roundup of articles about using the SOAP web services. And you can see that there are lots of different articles about the design of web services how we can do this, and also fetching and selecting data. So looking at the differences between these different query mechanisms and thinking about the design of our system from a performance perspective. You can start to see this in the test harness. You can start to see why it's important to give consideration to performance. If I go and switch over into my test harness, I need to end this actually because that session had been destroyed. If I go back into my test harness and rerun this, so my session is going to make sure that I'm pointing at my correct endpoint. I can log on, and I can, here you can see that I can use the idea of query, find companies using query. So enter part of a name in the search box. Let's say I'm entering companies that begin with A, so finding companies where the where clause is like A. Well, if I now OK that, you can see, and this is going to take some time, talk amongst yourselves, this is taking a little while, and this is because what it's doing inside the database is that this is resolving into a very large number of SQL interactions, pulling back the data. So design of the application is very, very important. Now we've got result sets. Now, I was only using the result set to produce a list of company names, and it's limited to 100 records. That was part of the choking, the restriction. So I've got 100 names there, and you saw how long it took. But I can do the equivalent fetch of using, instead of query, I can use, say, using query record. Query record is a little bit more fiddly to pull back, but if I pull back customers from the system, you can see that it's limited to 100 records, so bang, straight back. It's very, very fast because I am limiting myself to pulling back from a single table or from a single result set. And even faster is if I look for a list of companies for company type using query ID. So this is just where I want IDs that match particular criteria, and you can see that that comes back blazingly fast. So web services, although I gave you the warning right at the beginning that web services can be slow, actually you can design web services so that they skip and they are as fast as anything, but you have to design them, and that's why it's so important to think about the design of what you're doing and the way in which you consume and write the code that says, right, give me the next thing, taking small bites, the idea of querying, getting 100 or however many is the result set, and then the next, then the next, then the next. Design within the web services is so important, and you can see that the slides, etc., that I've covered here actually discuss all of these different mechanisms to allow us to do that. So we've got examples within the snippets, within the blog articles, on how to work with selection lists, how to work with updates, how to insert, how to carry out different types of inserts as well, and when you're looking at pulling information from external systems and putting into CRM, what are all the considerations that you might need to make. Your teaching, best teaching tool is going to be the blog articles, the revision videos that are on the YouTube channel, and also the snippets and the example Training West test harness, so you can see that.